Jimmy Fallon was sharing heartwarming stories about lasting love during his Valentine's Day special, when a voice from the audience stopped him completely. "My husband died 50 years ago," said the elderly woman in the 8th row, "and I still wear his ring every day." The words carried such profound sadness that the entire studio fell silent. It was February 14th, and The Tonight Show was celebrating love in all its forms. The audience was in a festive mood, laughing at Jimmy's jokes about awkward first dates and marriage proposals gone wrong. But Ruth Patterson had come with a different kind of love story, one that time couldn't heal. She sat alone in seat 8C, a petite woman of 72 with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her left hand rested on her purse, and even from a distance, the simple gold band on her ring finger caught the studio lights. There was something about her stillness that drew attention, a quiet dignity that spoke of decades of carefully carried grief. Jimmy had noticed Ruth during the pre-show warm-up, because she wasn't laughing with the rest of the audience. While everyone else enjoyed the Valentine's-themed banter, Ruth sat quietly with a distant expression. She seemed to be somewhere else entirely, lost in memories that belonged to another lifetime. "Ma'am," Jimmy said, setting down his cue cards and stepping toward the audience. "What did you say?" His voice was gentle, respectful, sensing he was about to hear something important. Ruth rose slowly to her feet, her movements careful and deliberate. "I said my husband died 50 years ago," Ruth repeated, her voice clear despite the tremor of emotion. "And everyone keeps telling me to move on. But how do you move on from the love of your life?" The question hung in the air like a prayer. The cameras found Ruth automatically, but this wasn't entertainment anymore. Jimmy's expression changed completely as he understood the weight of what she was sharing. Here was a woman who had spent 5 decades loving someone she could no longer touch. "What's your name?" Jimmy asked softly as he walked toward her row. "Ruth Patterson," she replied with quiet dignity. "I was married to Harold Patterson for exactly 3 months and 12 days before he shipped out to Vietnam." The specificity of the time frame hit everyone like a physical blow. Jimmy reached Ruth's row and could see her more clearly now. The wedding ring was simple, worn thin by decades of wear, but still proudly displayed on her finger. 3 months, Jimmy repeated, struggling to process the mathematics of her loss. "You were barely married." Ruth's smile was both heartbreaking and beautiful. "But we were completely married. Every day of those 3 months was a lifetime of love." Behind the scenes, the control room had gone completely quiet. Producers who usually managed every second of airtime stood transfixed by the raw honesty unfolding before them. This was no longer television. This was life and love and loss in its purest form. "Tell me about Harold," Jimmy said, his voice thick with emotion. Ruth's face transformed immediately, lighting up with the radiance that only comes when someone speaks about their greatest love. Harold was 23, tall and handsome, with the kindest brown eyes you've ever seen. He was studying to be a teacher before the war, Ruth continued, her voice growing stronger with each memory. He wanted to teach history to high school students. He said young people needed to understand the past to build a better future. The audience was completely captivated now, understanding they were witnessing something sacred. Ruth opened her purse and pulled out a small, worn photograph. "This was our wedding day, December 15th, 1969. I was 22, he was 23. We thought we had forever." Jimmy looked at the photograph, seeing 2 young people radiant with love and hope. "You were both so young," he whispered. Ruth nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes, but her voice remaining steady. "Harold got his draft notice 2 weeks after our wedding," Ruth explained. "We knew it was coming, but we thought maybe, somehow, it wouldn't happen. We were wrong." The pain in her voice was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. "He left for basic training in January," Ruth continued. "We wrote letters every day. I still have every single one he sent me." Her hand went instinctively to her purse, where Jimmy could see the corner of a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "What was the last thing he said to you?" Jimmy asked gently. Ruth's composure finally began to crack as she remembered that final goodbye. He said, "Keep my ring warm for me, Ruthie. I'll be back to claim it, and you." The studio was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Ruth continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Harold died in a helicopter crash 3 months later. He never even made it to combat. Just a training accident that took 6 boys who should have lived to be old men." Jimmy felt tears forming in his own eyes, as the full scope of Ruth's loss became clear. "And you've worn his ring ever since?" Ruth nodded, looking down at the simple gold band that had been her constant companion for 5 decades. "Every single day, for 50 years, Ruth confirmed. "People tell me I should take it off, that I should date, that I should get back out there. But how do you replace perfect love? How do you settle for less when you've had everything?" The question resonated through the studio like a bell. Jimmy understood he was in the presence of a love so pure, so complete, that it had sustained a woman through half a century of loneliness. "Ruth," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "you haven't been waiting for Harold to come back." Ruth looked confused. "What do you mean?" Jimmy smiled through his tears, suddenly understanding something profound. "He never left. Harold has been with you every single day for 50 years. In that ring, in those letters, in the way you've kept his memory alive." The revelation hit Ruth like a gentle wave. She looked down at her ring finger, seeing it perhaps for the first time, not as a symbol of loss, but as a symbol of presence. "You think he's still here?" she asked, hope creeping into her voice. "Ruth," Jimmy said, moving closer to her, "I think Harold Patterson is the luckiest man who ever lived. Because 50 years after he died, his wife still loves him exactly the way she did on their wedding day." The audience began to react, not with applause, but with the kind of emotional recognition that transcends entertainment. "But everyone says I should move on," Ruth protested weakly, as if she'd been programmed to believe her love was somehow wrong. Jimmy shook his head firmly. "Ruth, you didn't stop living when Harold died. You started living for both of you." The moment that followed became television legend. Jimmy asked Ruth if she would come up on stage, not as a spectacle, but as someone whose story needed to be shared with the world. "I don't know what to say," Ruth protested gently. "Say whatever's in your heart," Jimmy replied. "Say what you want Harold to know." Ruth nodded and began walking toward the stage, her steps steadier now, as if she was walking toward something rather than away from it. Once on stage, Ruth sat in the guest chair, but Jimmy didn't go behind his desk. Instead, he pulled up a chair beside her, creating an intimate space for conversation. "Ruth," he said, "what would you tell other people who've lost the love of their life?" Ruth thought for a long moment before answering. "I would tell them that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes form." She looked directly into the camera, speaking to countless viewers who might be struggling with their own losses. "People think I'm stuck in the past," Ruth continued, her voice growing stronger. "But I'm not stuck, I'm connected. Every morning when I put on Harold's ring, I'm not dwelling on what I lost. I'm celebrating what I had." Jimmy felt compelled to ask the question everyone was thinking. "Have you ever been tempted to take off the ring, to try to love someone else?" Ruth's answer was immediate and certain. "Never," she said without hesitation. "Not because I'm afraid or because I think Harold would be jealous, but because some loves are once in a lifetime. I was blessed enough to find mine when I was 22. Why would I spend the rest of my life looking for something I've already had?" The wisdom in her words hit everyone in the studio simultaneously. Jimmy leaned forward, speaking directly to Ruth, but knowing millions were listening. "Ruth, do you think Harold would want you to be happy?" "Jimmy," Ruth said with a smile that lit up the entire studio, "I am happy. I wake up every morning knowing I was loved completely by the most wonderful man who ever lived." How many people can say that? The question reframed everything. "You're not a widow waiting for life to begin again," Jimmy realized aloud. "You're a woman whose love story is still being written." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of recognition, not sadness. "Exactly. she whispered. "Harold and I aren't finished. Our love story doesn't end just because he's not physically here. Every day I live with kindness. Every time I help someone else. Every moment I choose love over bitterness. That's us, together, still writing our story." Jimmy made a decision that would define this moment forever. "Ruth," he said, standing up and extending his hand, "would you dance with me?" I think Harold would want someone to dance with his wife on Valentine's Day. The Roots, without being asked, began playing something slow and beautiful. Ruth took Jimmy's hand and stood up, and for 3 minutes, they danced quietly while she told him about the last dance she'd shared with Harold before he left for basic training. "He wasn't a good dancer," Ruth laughed through her tears as they moved slowly around the stage. "He kept stepping on my feet, but he hummed in my ear, and it was the most beautiful music I've ever heard." Jimmy found himself humming softly, trying to give Ruth that same feeling of being cherished. When the song ended, Ruth did something that surprised everyone. She took off her wedding ring for the first time in 50 years. The audience gasped, thinking she was finally ready to let go. Instead, she kissed it gently and put it back on. "I'm not taking it off," she explained to the stunned studio. "I'm putting it back on with purpose. Not because I'm stuck in the past, but because I choose this love every single day. This ring isn't a prison, it's a promise I keep making." The applause that followed was unlike anything ever heard in that studio. It wasn't entertainment applause. It was the sound of 300 people recognizing the power of love to transcend time, death, and societal expectations. But Ruth wasn't finished. She looked directly into the camera and spoke to Harold as if he were sitting in the front row. "Harold Patterson," she said, her voice clear and strong, "you asked me to keep your ring warm. Mission accomplished, my love. It's been warm with my love for 50 years, and it'll stay warm until I see you again." Jimmy wiped his eyes openly, no longer caring about his television image. "Ruth," he said, "you've just shown all of us what true love looks like. Not the beginning of love, not the easy part, but the hard part. The part that lasts." "Love isn't just about the good times," Ruth replied, looking out at the audience. "It's about the choice you make, every single day, to keep loving. Even when it hurts, even when people don't understand, even when you're the only one left to do the loving." The show ended with Ruth still on stage, wearing Harold's ring and smiling with a peace that seemed to radiate from within. The image became iconic, a woman who had turned grief into grace, loss into love, and waiting into living. After the cameras stopped rolling, Ruth was surrounded by audience members sharing their own stories of love and loss. She listened to each one, offering comfort and wisdom drawn from 5 decades of choosing love over bitterness. The episode aired on Valentine's Day and became the most-watched Tonight Show in the program's history. But more importantly, it started a conversation about love that lasts, about the courage to stay committed to someone you can no longer touch, and about the difference between being stuck and being faithful. Ruth received over 50,000 letters from viewers around the world. Widows and widowers wrote to thank her for making them feel less alone. Young couples wrote to say her story had changed how they viewed commitment. Children wrote to say they finally understood why their grandparents still talked about their deceased spouses. 6 months later, Ruth returned to The Tonight Show for a follow-up segment. She still wore Harold's ring, but now she also wore something else: the confidence of someone whose love story had inspired millions. "I'm not just Harold's widow anymore," she explained. "I'm Ruth, the woman who proved that some loves really do last forever." Jimmy learned something profound that Valentine's Day that changed how he approached every show. "I always thought love stories were about beginnings," he said later. "Ruth taught me that the most beautiful love stories are about middles and endings, about the choice to keep loving when it's hard." Ruth Patterson lived 3 more years after her appearance on The Tonight Show, and she spent every day of those years wearing Harold's ring with pride. When she passed away peacefully in her sleep, She was buried wearing the simple gold band that had connected her to her greatest love for 50. At her funeral, her pastor read a letter Ruth had written to be shared after her death. "I'm not sad to be leaving," the letter said. "I'm excited to be going because for the first time in 53 years, I'm going to see Harold again, and he's going to slip this ring off my finger and put it back on properly, the way it should have been all along, as a symbol not of what we lost, but of what we found." The ring was buried with Ruth, but her message lived on. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It doesn't fade when time passes. It doesn't weaken when others don't understand. True love, the kind Ruth and Harold shared, finds a way to last forever. One choice, one day, one worn gold band at a time. Their love story, interrupted by war but never truly ended, reminded everyone who heard it that some promises are worth keeping for a lifetime, and some rings are worth wearing until the very end.